So first of all, thank you for the opportunity to talk today. And I'm going to focus on supporting mental health in a digital world with a focus on youth mental health. And I guess one of the reasons I thought it was important to think about mental health and in the context of the digital world is, well, the digital world is almost everywhere, particularly now during lockdown. We're kind of increasingly sort of having to interact in this particular environment. And it can be quite complex to navigate the digital world, both for young people and for parents, as well as practitioners and so on. And we're also constantly seeing headlines that talked about sort of the negative impacts of the digital world on mental health. And it can be quite scary thinking about what these impacts are. But often these headlines don't really appreciate some of the more nuanced approaches to the kind of why some of the impacts may be in relation to mental health. So also wanted to kind of talk a little bit about some of the nuances in the relationship between the digital world and mental health. And also recognising that whilst there are risks, there are also new opportunities that the digital world can bring in terms of supporting youth mental health. So in terms of what I was going to talk about this evening, first of all, I thought I would summarise just a little bit of research examining the link between the digital world and youth mental health, just to kind of say a little bit about what we know so far. And then introduce a project called eNurture, which its main aim is to support young people in the digital world in the context of their mental health, and talk about some of the work we've done with young children and adolescents to kind of give us a youth-informed perspective in terms of what young people understand in terms of the risks and opportunities for being online. Then finish up with some tips for staying safe online, and then provide the opportunity for you to ask any questions and have your say, and provide any other recommendations or suggestions that you might have in terms of supporting youth mental health in a digital world. So first of all, thinking about digital use, we know that access to the digital world and mobile devices begins quite early. A recent study suggested that nearly half of 11-year-olds own their own mobile phones, and this increases to around 85% by the age of 14. So lots of people have access to smartphones and mobile phones, and evidence also suggests that young people are increasingly using social media across the course of their childhood and adolescence. So adolescents will be accessing social media for a greater number of hours than younger children. And in fact, almost all adolescents use some form of social media. So we see that there is an increase in the amount of time that young people are spending online. And in recent decades, there's also been evidence to suggest that there may also be increases in terms of some mental health difficulties among adolescents and young people. So there has been a suggestion that the increase in anxiety and depression problems might be driven by changes in the way that adolescents interact with each other through social media or through the amount of time that they're spending online. So recent research has tried to examine whether there is a link between digital use amongst young people and their mental health. So does digital use impact on mental health? Well, historically, research has tended to focus on screen time, and overall research suggests that the findings are quite mixed, they're very inconsistent, and where there are associations between the amount of time that young people spend online and their mental health, these associations tend to be really, really small, and some have suggested that they don't really have any practical or clinical significance. So it would suggest that there isn't really any strong connection between the amount of time that young people spend online and their mental health. And also a lot of research is cross-sectional, so we only have the associations at one point in time, which means it's quite difficult to discern cause and effect. So we don't really know the direction of the association, so what event might happen first. So as I said, there's quite a limited evidence for strong connections between the amount of time that young people spend on social media and other technologies and their mental health. However, it's important to think that screen time is measuring the amount of hours or minutes that young people might be on their phones or engaging in online activities. And actually, this is quite problematic for a couple of reasons. So first of all, spending time on a device or on a screen is now actually a really required part of many adolescents' educational experiences, especially during lockdown. Many of us are required to be online for work and for educational purposes. And it's also a really key mechanism for communicating with family and friends. And also mobile devices are becoming a primary means through which young people might access entertainment. So things like streaming videos, watching films, streaming music, and online gaming and so on. So experts have argued for a while now that actually focusing on screen time could be considered to be outdated. So if it is outdated, what should we be focusing on, and why are we still asking this question about what the relationship is between digital use and mental health? Well, actually, the nature of the online activity is likely to be more relevant to our understanding of potential mental health impacts, rather than measuring the amount of minutes or hours that someone might spend on their mobile phone. So, for example, associations between digital use and mental health have been found to vary depending on kind of the context and the interactions. So if we think about online social networking sites, where interactions are positive, so enhancing social support and facilitating social communication, those kinds of positive interactions tend to be associated with more positive well-being or kind of less anxiety or depression symptoms. But where interactions on these social networking sites are negative, so thinking about social comparisons or feeling excluded from groups, that tends to be associated with less well-being, so higher anxiety or depression type symptoms. And a recent study suggested that some teenagers who are reporting spending more time on social media, so in the context of text messaging or WhatsApp, they actually reported feeling better than those who are texting less frequently, suggesting that actually it's misguided to think about just time, and actually it might be to do with the quality of interactions, perhaps both on and offline, in the sense of connectedness. And it's also important to consider that there might be specific experiences that occur online that might put young people at increased risk in terms of mental health difficulties. And a key one that we're probably all familiar with is this concept of cyberbullying or cyber victimization. So this would include things like social exclusion and online conflict. And also access to risky content can also put children's mental health at greater risk. So for example, if children are witnessing behaviours such as alcohol or substance misuse quite frequently, particularly if it's among peers, they may be more likely to try these behaviours. It might normalise some of these behaviours. So thinking about the type of content that young people are accessing online. And also evidence suggests that young people who experience more adversity outside of the online world, so thinking about offline, they seem to be more at risk online as well. So these might be, for example, young people who have a history of being bullied in the offline domain, and also young people who are struggling with mental health difficulties. But on the flip side of this, actually those who have kind of more positive experiences, so where they've got sort of more positive relationships with teachers or peers or family members, this tends to overlap with their online experiences, suggesting that where they have positive interactions offline, it can also facilitate positive interactions in the online space, which can help support positive mental health and well-being. And when we're thinking about using digital media in kind of the context of mental health and well-being, finally, it's important to think about the displacement of other activities. So if you're spending a lot of time online and in the digital world, what other activities are we displacing and not doing? So just to give one example, lots of young people report using their phones before they go to bed instead of trying to get to sleep. And we know that sleep hygiene is associated with youth mental health, and using your phone can disrupt some of those, can disrupt your sleep hygiene. And I'm not going to talk too much about that because we actually have a talk later in the week that's focused specifically on sleep in relation to mental health. But it's another consideration in terms of thinking about supporting child wellbeing. So overall, it suggests that it's quite a complicated picture. It's not just a case of thinking about how often young people are online, but actually thinking about how young people might be using the online space, what they might be using it for, and how it fits in with their wider day-to-day life in the offline world. So this brings it in this new project called eNurture, which focuses on promoting young people's mental health in a digital world. And this is a project that has a number of aims. So one of which is to explore how the digital environment has changed the ways in which young people experience and interact with families, schools and peers, and also to try to disentangle digital risks from opportunities. And as part of this work, we've done some work with young children, both in primary schools and secondary schools, to try to have a youth-informed perspective in terms of what their understanding is of kind of the digital risks and the digital opportunities in the online space. So as I said, we've spoken to young people from both primary schools and from secondary schools. And actually all the young people that we spoke to felt that social media interactions were linked to mental health and well-being, and that the social media and the wider online space could have both positive and negative impacts on their mental health. So thinking about digital risks from this youth perspective, actually across both primary and secondary school, they were very good at identifying the specific risks that might have impacted on them or people that they knew. And across primary and secondary schools, the things that they identified were remarkably similar. And so one of the main risks that they identified was cyberbullying. And they did say that this could be from friends or it could be from anonymous sources. And some young people had said that some adults had asked them to just ignore the bullying and to dismiss the bullying. And some felt that this was potentially quite difficult because unlike traditional bullying with cyberbullying, it can be quite continuous. It's not something that you can escape. So it's something that's quite difficult to ignore. So young people often felt like they needed more help with these kinds of difficulties. Both primary school and secondary school pupils also said they felt that companies should do more to protect young people from seeing inappropriate or risky content. Many young people said it was far too easy to bypass any age restrictions or age ratings. And they said some social media sites would recommend content related to what you had already been looking at. So sometimes it was easy to kind of see more extreme content that might be inappropriate. And some apps and social media sites do provide the opportunity to set particular settings so that you can avoid seeing some of these images or some of this content. But many said that in many of these apps, it would just blur out the images, and many were curious and would just want to click on it just to see what the image was. And this would undo many of the settings. And they felt that companies just shouldn't provide these images at all. So obviously there's still elements of what they felt that companies should be doing to work harder to protect the online space for young people. Young people also had an awareness of the fact that if you didn't have the correct settings, anyone could contact you or find out about you. And actually some young people, many had private platforms, but some had open platforms, which means that anybody can read about what you've got on your profile. And they also said that they had this awareness that you couldn't necessarily trust who you were talking to. And they talked about this concept of digital stranger danger. So stranger danger is probably familiar to many of us being taught in school. And they said that actually with stranger danger, it provides quite coherent rules about how to behave if you're out in the real world and a stranger approaches you that you don't know. And actually young people are saying they have this awareness that it's important to employ the same kinds of caution to their interactions in the online space. Young people also highlighted the pressure of looking perfect. So almost all adolescents in particular said that they added filters to their images. And they also felt the need to filter their lives to create the impression of the perfect life. And they said they were aware that everybody filters images, so they were aware that what they're seeing isn't necessarily a true representation of somebody or somebody's life. And they did have lessons on this and lessons on body image, which they said helped. But they said they still found it difficult to live up to this pressure of having the perfect body and the perfect life. And they also had concerns about where to go to get reliable information. And this was in the context of fake news and trying to identify what's trustworthy and what's not trustworthy. But they also said that if they wanted to go online for help or support for any mental health concerns for themselves or for friends, they wouldn't necessarily know where to go and what was trustworthy. And they said that the only way they felt that they would know where to go for such reliable information was if they were already in contact with someone if they were receiving professional support, and that person could recommend some online or digital supports. And they said that often they found it quite difficult to judge the trustworthiness of websites and would often go by gut instinct about what looked sensible. They also said that they could be aware that being online, being on their phones could become an addiction, and that many expressed frustration, saying they were aware that sometimes it was a waste of time and they didn't really understand why it was a problem. And it's worth bearing in mind that actually to keep us going back to these apps, many of these apps are designed to be addictive in some way. Young people also expressed frustration at being encouraged to buy things, so having targeted adverts or having pop-ups, and also having buy-in game content. They found that very frustrating. And they also had concerns about the blue light and the impact on their sleep, but as I said, many children still used their phones before they went to bed. And they also had concerns about privacy. And this was not just in terms of privacy settings within an app, so making sure that it's closed so not everybody can see, but they also had concerns about where their data was going that was held by companies. So for example, some apps will track your movements, and they were concerned about whether companies would know where they were and whether that was liable to being hacked, and how that was used in terms of targeting adverts or how their data was being used, and whether it was possible for hackers to access other online devices and whether other devices in the home are listening. They also acknowledged that whilst they themselves see the online space as just an extension of their existing friendships and networks and didn't necessarily consider it as a separate space, they were aware that spending a lot of time on social media and in the digital world could lead to family arguments. But they did also, many acknowledged that where young people are on social media to the exclusion of other activities, that sometimes this intervention was justified. And they also had concerns or awareness in terms of risks, that there's quite a lot of inconsistencies in how it might be taught. So many young people do get taught about staying safe online, but it's not necessarily consistent across schools. And many young people felt that there should be more information. They also said that a lot of the information that they received was preventative, so how to stay safe online, which they felt obviously was very important and they should stay, but they said that they would additionally want information on where to go and what sorts of helps and supports if they found themselves in a difficult situation. So not just preventative supports, but thinking about how to teach young children about problem solving, where to go to get help if they found themselves in difficulties. And related to this, young people did say that often they felt they would be more likely to get into trouble if they had found themselves in difficulties online. So sometimes we're worried that they would be obliged to deal with these sorts of things on their own. And so they felt that there should be clearer support and guidance from adults to help them navigate some of these difficulties. In terms of the digital opportunities that young people highlighted, a key one was communication and socialisation and social support. So keeping in touch with friends and family, particularly if they were not nearby, or if they weren't in the same class or the same school, or particularly now during lockdown, being able to keep in touch with family and friends. Some young people said it was also important to help with making friends, particularly if they didn't identify strongly with peers in their class, or if they wanted to make friends in relation to a specific interest. They also highlighted the importance of practical help, so being able to engage peers if they had problems with homework, being able to use educational apps and being able to access the internet almost instantly. Although again, there was this caveat of recognising what might be a reliable or trustworthy source. And they also recognised the importance of access to entertainment, so music, films, and reading and that sort of thing. The younger children also said that age ratings really were helpful, as it helped them decide if content was appropriate for them, and it allowed them to navigate the digital world in a space that made them feel safe because they weren't worried about coming across content that wasn't appropriate. And adolescents and older children also highlighted that the digital space can be very important for kind of the travelling of news and can mobilise people. So they cited the example of the school strike for climate change, but they said conversely, sometimes news that might be less reliable can also travel quickly, and actually it can take a while for the truth to kind of come out, and by which point some of this news has already spread. Adolescents also highlighted that the online space can be really useful to share things that they find difficult to talk about face to face. So for example, many young people said they had WhatsApp groups with family members or friends, or they might send emails to start that conversation that might be otherwise difficult to be had, or they can look online for supports to see if people have experienced similar difficulties. And they also had the recognition that different people like to engage in different ways, so not just for socialising, but also for support for mental health. So some people will prefer face-to-face interactions, and some people may prefer the online space. But largely speaking, most of the adolescents said that they would prefer a mixture. So initially having that face-to-face space, recognising that somebody cares and is listening, and then in between those face-to-face contacts, perhaps supplement that with an online digital space. And we did ask young people about what their top tips would be for staying safe online, and actually probably some of these and many of these may be relevant to all of us. And there may be things that we are already aware of, but they can be useful as a reminder. So for example, if you feel worried about something, young people should tell an adult that they trust. Don't ever give away personal information, and don't share your passwords. Ensure that you get permission to post pictures of family and friends online, and don't trust pop-ups. And they felt it was important to always be kind and not to trust anyone that you meet online or people that you don't know online. Also ensure that you don't play games that aren't age appropriate, and think about safety as though you are on your own. So thinking about this digital stranger danger. But in terms of thinking about how adults might be able to support youth mental health specifically, so supporting mental health online, what are some of the things that we might be able to do? And the acronym on the right-hand side is taken from the NSPCC, and these guidance are drawn up from a range of experts as well as young people, and fit into some of those things such as talking and exploring. And one of the key things is talking and encouraging conversations and talking about the digital space. So asking young people what apps they're using, what they might use them for, and making it okay to have those conversations about what children are doing online, and finding out about the apps that they're using, and listen to any concerns that they might have. And often young people might know information that we don't, so we can also get information ourselves and share information together. And in terms of finding reliable information, actually we all find it difficult sometimes to know what's trustworthy or reliable. And just because children are born into a digital age, we can't assume that they will innately know what's a reliable source. So it can be useful to explore or figure out together what might be trustworthy resources online. So identifying sites and then having a discussion about why it might be reliable or why it might not be reliable. And children can have different perspectives, so it can be quite interesting to find out what sorts of sources they identify. And as I said, this can be an opportunity to let young people educate us in terms of what apps they're using and what information they consider reliable and why. And if this is something that people are particularly interested in, the 9th of February is Internet Safety Day, and it's focusing on trustworthy information. And they have a website with a range of resources across different developmental stages and ages. And so suggesting different projects that families or schools might like to engage in terms of identifying trustworthy resources online. Young people also felt that it was important to know what apps what apps your children have, and obviously this won't necessarily apply for everybody, but particularly in primary school, this was something that the young people themselves identified, and people in primary schools also said they felt that they shouldn't be allowed to download an app without their parents' permission. And across both primary and secondary school groups that we spoke to, they did say it's important for adults not to assume that all apps are safe. So there was an assumption that some apps might be safe if they're just kind of streaming video services, but actually if there's a possibility to engage in that content and comment, then this might lead to cyberbullying. So actually this goes back to encouraging those conversations to find out how young people are using social media to allow it to be okay to have those conversations about what's happening online. Also, it's important to understand age ratings, and this can be a useful guide in terms of what's appropriate. And also social media, the age rating is actually 13, but we know that many young people are engaging in social media much younger than this. So one avenue is to think about parental controls, and this can be helpful. And there is a guide from the UK Safer Internet Centre website, which gives information about setting up parental controls. Although this might be considered kind of not the whole solution, but more of a supplement to having those conversations to allow children to kind of explore and engage in the digital space. It's also important to think about cyberbullies and cyberbullying, which I was going to talk about in a bit more detail on the next slide, because it's a concern that was raised by young people as being one of the main considerations in relation to their mental health. And children and young people that we spoke to also had a few practical suggestions in terms of supporting youth mental health in relation to the digital space. So one of the things they suggested was that actually sometimes when they are online, it might be for education or it might be for keeping in touch with their friends, and kind of this recognition that sometimes it's a waste of time, but it's not always a waste of time, and trying to figure out when those times are. Some young people also recommended not having any technology while eating together as a family or while sharing family time. And it's also possible to set time limits on your phone. But again, young people said it was easy to bypass or override this, so they might need help in terms of sticking to it. And young people also highlighted the importance of enjoying time together offline. But obviously all families are different, so some of these suggestions won't necessarily work for everybody, but just some starting points in terms of supporting youth mental health in the digital space. So focusing on cyberbullying, so where there might be quite different people who have come to the webinar this evening. So there's some advice for young people as well as advice for adults, so parents, carers and teachers and so on. But when you think about cyberbullying, particularly for younger people, they're more likely to be bullied by somebody that they know, and it can often be a continuation of what's already happening in school. And cyberbullying and bullying more generally can come from friends. And there's an anti-bullying charity called Kidscape that does provide some suggestions to help young people identify when they might be experiencing what they call a toxic friendship. So things like being pressured to do what you don't want to do, being laughed at or having other people encouraged to laugh at you or posting mean things about you online, just to give a few examples. So in terms of advice for young people, again, talk to somebody that you trust, be it a parent or a teacher. And often it's better not to retaliate or to respond in this situation. So often people have this phrase of don't feed the trolls. Obviously never blame yourself. And where possible, try to keep screenshots and save messages. Keep a record of what's being said or what's being posted. It's also important to remember that you can report or block or mute contacts. And it's also important to recognise that you might need to take time out. So often when young people are experiencing cyberbullying, there is a tendency to want to know what's being posted about you and feeling the need to check a lot of the time. So it can be important to take time out and kind of spend time with people who make you feel good about yourself, be it family or friends. And if you're the person who has posted mean things about somebody or unpleasant content, it's important to delete any unkind posts and make sure you apologise to the person for that as well. And in terms of advice for adults, so here it can be important to have open conversations with children. And this can happen from a relatively early age once children are online. It provides an opportunity to check in on how they are, and it makes young people aware that they can talk to you if they've got something that worries them or something that upsets them, and they know that someone will be there if they need some help. Again, privacy settings are quite important. So as I said, although there are age restrictions on social media, many young people bypass these and are online. And actually thinking of privacy settings is important for all of us. So if we don't have the right settings, then some private information might be publicly available, and this might make us more vulnerable to cyberbullying. It can also be important to explore online safety together. So for example, if someone is being cyberbullied, talk about options for problem solving, and ask a young person what they would like to happen in an ideal world. What do they want the consequences to be of any action that might be taken? Again, can set boundaries and controls. So thinking about parental controls kind of in the context of these other suggestions. So it's just kind of a supplement as part of a toolkit of a range of tools that we might be able to use in terms of supporting young people. And again, we might, as adults, want to support or help to report or block where if young people perhaps don't know how to do this or might need some help with this. And if people are struggling with how to report harmful content, or they're not happy with the response that they've got when they try to report this action, there is a website called Reporting Harmful Content, and this offers support and practical advice on how to go about doing this. Obviously, we can also report cyberbullying and bullying more generally to schools. So schools do have a duty of care to support young people. And again, it can be useful there to take evidence of the experiences of cyberbullying to help with this. And whilst cyberbullying is not considered a crime, people, if they feel it's necessary, can report to the police in the context of harassment or threatening behaviours. And also, if there are concerns about inappropriate communication with children, there's also a website that has links to how to report this, called the Child Exploitation and Online Protection Centre website, for those who have concerns about inappropriate contact. And finally, it's important for all of us to be mindful about being role models. So young children and young people will model our behaviour, and they're seeing how we behave both online and offline. So it can be important to try to kind of be the behaviour that we would like to see. And finally, just to bring this all together really, and I guess summarise what we've been talking about. As I said, in terms of thinking about the relationship between the digital world and youth mental health, focusing on screen time is now thought to be outdated, and it's more important to think about how we use social media and why we use social media and how it fits in with our wider day-to-day life. And also remember that there might be some particular behaviours or experiences that might put young people more at risk of negative outcomes in relation to their mental health. And a lot of what we hear does focus on the risks of the digital world. And I'm aware that probably I've also done the same, for focusing on the risks and how because I wanted to focus on how we might support children in the context of those risks. But it's really important to remember that there are some potential benefits in this digital space, and even young people themselves really highlight the importance of social connection and social support, and the possibility of wider help seeking. And actually, young people were very good at identifying both risks and opportunities, but suggested that they might need additional support on how to navigate some of these risks. So they're good at identifying the risks, but they might need some help in terms of their problem solving. And as I said earlier, some of these suggestions in terms of how to support young people online and other practical suggestions won't necessarily work for everybody. Different people do different things within their families, so it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. So I would be very interested in hearing about your questions, but also hearing about any other practical strategies that might help other people in terms of supporting young people in relation to their digital aspect and mental health. And also hearing about what you think research might want to focus on in the context of the digital space in mental health. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. and see if there are any questions.
We've had a question from Donna, and she's asked, what do you think we should concentrate on post-lockdown regarding young people's mental health and online use?
I think that's very difficult to say it in some ways. So we know that some young people, we know that there's a massive digital divide, there's a digital inequality. So some people won't have been able to engage in education or any other aspect of the digital world necessarily. And this could have an impact on their mental health. We know that young people are worried about falling behind in schooling and kind of that uncertainty around how their work might be assessed and that sort of thing. So I think one of the main things is to ensure that there is an open communication across young people and adults, so that young people feel that they can talk about any concerns that they have. And the young people themselves said that they would want advice and support in terms of what to do if they find themselves in a difficult situation online. So they get lots, they say they do get education with regards to how to stay safe online, but not necessarily so much on what to do if they find that actually perhaps they haven't necessarily stuck to all those guidelines and have found themselves in a difficult situation. So rather than being in trouble, actually, how can we support them?
Brilliant, thank you. And we've had an anonymous question. What age bracket is recommended for children to have a smartphone?
I think that will vary between household and from person to person. I think, so as we know that almost half of 11-year-olds are likely to have smartphones, and it's a very, very difficult balance. So so some people would prefer young people to have a smartphone later on, but then if there's the concern about all my friends have a smartphone and I don't have a smartphone, that can also be something that young people find difficult. So I wouldn't like to put a recommendation on that because I think it will vary depending very much on individuals and individual families. But I think where there's kind of those parental kind of controls to support, but supported through with open communication about the risks and opportunities and exploring it together, particularly for younger children, exploring the online world together in the first instance can be a useful way of navigating that online space before kind of going off on their own.
Brilliant, thank you. We've had another question from Andy Jones. I'm very sorry, Andy, for missing this. My little chat box was covering your question. So Andy is the head of health and wellbeing in North Wales. And he says, in my experience, it seems an issue as young people, adults/adolescents, use digital devices really late at night, which impacts massively on their education. This obviously links with sleep patterns, but also their interaction with adults. So obviously you touched on this, Ruth. I was just wondering whether there's anything additional that you'd like to mention on that.
Yeah, I think this is actually very important, and it's something that myself and some colleagues are interested in exploring in further detail. So young people, and actually even adults do this, we all know, many of us know about sleep hygiene, and we might still check our phones before we go to bed, check emails or social media. And young people also report that they are also doing this. So it'd be interesting to explore with young people if there are particular reasons. So are they talking with their friends? Is it the fear of missing out with social media updating all the time and not wanting to miss out on the news? And how can we support children and adolescents and their families? So you hear that some families put digital devices kind of in a drawer. So nobody has access to their devices before they go to bed, and it's just kind of what everybody in the family does. But that doesn't necessarily work for some people. I use my phone as an alarm clock. It's not ideal because it means the first thing I do when I get up is if I chose to, I could access my emails. So thinking about why children are on their phones. So particularly young girls do express this kind of pressure to be a 24/7 friend, so being available and not wanting to let their friends down. So thinking about how we can negotiate and navigate and perhaps redress some of those issues and expectations.
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, I guess it's that trying to find what works for you and your family and kind of taking on board all the kind of advice that's out there, but not expecting it to work perfectly and kind of finding those rhythms and what works for you, I guess. So Donna has asked, do you think there should be more education from primary age around social media and excessive phone use?
Yes, I think many, so we went to primary schools and many of them did say they had conversations about staying safe online, and they also had an awareness of kind of the blue light on phones and its impact on sleep patterns and so on. But absolutely, we know that many young people are on social media and often are exposed to it in primary school age, either through their own smartphones or through siblings or through other experiences. And also it can be helpful in terms of kind of having the tools ready for when they do go online. Yeah. But I think some of that work is being done already in schools in terms of online safety and the digital stranger danger.
Yeah, I guess it's that difficult thing of constantly having to learn, is it, with so many changes happening all the time in the digital world, trying to keep up with it.
I think that's one of the difficulties, is actually apps are changing all the time, and there's new apps that are considered to be kind of the new trend. So older adolescents might not be engaging in the same apps that younger children are engaging in, and actually it's one of the reasons why, particularly in this context, it might be useful to kind of have the dialogue with young people, because they are going to find out about the new apps much earlier than we might.
Yeah, of course. So they're keeping you in the loop.
Yes.
So Jenny has asked, has there been any research into mobile use and poor social skills in the real world? If you're aware of that, Ruth.
Not that I'm aware of specifically. I think there is research looking at, so for example, lots of people suggested that there is an overlap between kind of your social ability and your social networks. There's an overlap between kind of positive interactions in your offline and online world. So your experiences offline, so in the real world, actually tend to be mirrored in the offline world. And actually this gives us quite a lot of scope in terms of intervention and prevention, because if we think about the risks kind of mirroring themselves, it means that a lot of the interventions and supports that we might target in the offline space might also help at least kind of buffer some of those online risks.
Brilliant, thank you. And we have another anonymous question. What are your thoughts on under 13s using TikTok, given its adult content?
I have to say that I did see a Panorama documentary about TikTok, and I think it's one of the apps that young people also expressed concern about, in terms of being able to see more and more extreme content that might be inappropriate, and other people, if you haven't got the settings right, people being able to contact you who you don't know. So I think where younger children are using TikTok, it's important to make sure that they have those settings, and also that young people, that parents are aware of some of these risks. Until I saw this Panorama documentary, it wasn't an app that I particularly knew about, let alone some of these risks. So often parents can be quite surprised by what young people are viewing online, including in TikTok. So I think it's quite. I think young people did express concern about many aspects of different apps. So there are some apps that will also track your location if you haven't got the settings correctly. So there are a range of different settings that might be important to think about, and particularly for younger children. But I think in terms of the content, it's potentially quite worrying what young people can see, and young people did themselves say that they think that companies should be doing more to protect young people. So the digital world is not necessarily a space that was originally designed for with young people in mind. So actually kind of have to go back and try to make it a space that's suitable for young people.
Yeah, that last question actually links in quite well with a question from Catherine, who says, do you think parents should be educated to be more aware? So it kind of obviously links in with some of the points you've just made. Are you aware of kind of anything that's out there at the moment like that?
So some of the resources that I'm happy to send around after this do provide some information, but I do think part of it is having those conversations with the young people and children. As I said, they might know more about the apps than we do, but absolutely there are resources that can help in terms of getting the right settings, finding out what different apps actually do and what they're for. And I do think that lots of people, adults, parents, teachers, carers, and so on, do want to know more about these apps and want to know what their children are doing online. So I think that there is a desire to have that information. So I will absolutely share the resources that I do have as a starting point.
Brilliant. I was just going to repeat that. The recording of Ruth's talk is going to be made available on the NCMH website. So we'll be sharing kind of all the resources that you've mentioned. We'll make them all easy to find and easy to click on. But yeah, so, Ruth can maybe add to that as well, which would be great. So I'm just going to take one more question. We've had an anonymous one. So the final question now is, what key findings / trends have you found in your research regarding body image in the digital world and the impact on young people?
So body image was something that particularly the adolescents raised, and that pressure to look perfect. And many said whilst they'd been taught about body image and, recognition that images might not be an accurate reflection, there is still that pressure, and many young people do have concerns about that. Conversely, some people did say that they can use social media for body positivity. So some people specifically follow people on social media for body positivity and or to support kind of a physically healthy lifestyle rather than an unrealistic lifestyle. So there are opportunities to help reframe that conversation, but partly it's obviously that's going to be potentially dictated by who young people choose to follow. But overall, I think that many young people feel like the unattainable, largely, pressures in terms of body image have a negative impact on their mental health.
Brilliant, thank you, Ruth. We've just had a comment from Michelle saying some parents are not open to having conversations about apps in my experience. So I guess that's another hurdle that you have to kind of come to, where parents aren't actually that open to having those conversations, despite it being, for the safety of their children. But yeah,
I think that's partly where, for example, if a young person is experiencing difficulties, they might want to go to a different trusted adult, be it a teacher or for example. But if this is in the context of a teacher wanting to talk to a parent, I think part of the hesitancy is obviously we do get a lot of negative press about the digital world and social media, and actually it's potentially quite a stressful or alien and complex environment that people are navigating. So I think sometimes it can be because it's just not necessarily a space that people necessarily recognise, and it might be like asking somebody to have a conversation about algebra. It's potentially quite stressful and intimidating, especially because I think sometimes people feel the pressure to know all the answers straight away, and if we don't, then it can create pressures.
Yeah, so I guess it's finding that balance in where the parents also feel supported to be able to have those conversations in order to support the children.
Yes, I think a lot of the things
a lot of work
about is creating the space for young people to have conversations, but actually part of the job is creating space to allow adults to have those kinds of conversations as well.
Brilliant, thank you. So yeah, I'm going to draw the evening to a close there, if that's all right, unless there's anything else you'd like to add.
Just thank you very much for having me, and I hope everybody's enjoyed the presentation. I've definitely enjoyed the opportunity to share some of what we know about the relationship between the digital world and mental health and wellbeing. So thank you.
Thank you so much for your time, Ruth.
No problem.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye. Good night, everyone.